why don't we sit for just a few minutes and gather our attention, our energy, and perhaps more fully arrive. So you can sit comfortably, close your eyes or not. Let your attention settle on an object like the feeling of the breath. And if it's the breath, let it be just the normal, natural breath wherever you feel it most distinctly. You can find that place, the nostrils, maybe the chest or the abdomen. Bring your attention there and just rest. See if you can feel one breath without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the next breath, just this one. And the crucial moment really happens, I believe, when we realize our attention has wandered. We've gone to the past or the future, or we've fallen asleep, something. We can recognize that we're no longer with the breath, see if we can gently let go and simply return. There's no need to judge yourself or berate yourself. We let go and we begin again. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes and lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation. So I really look forward to this day. We'll have obviously more periods of practice, somewhat longer than the one we just did. Um, I'll speak. I'd love to hear from you, either questions or comments. And we will take breaks repeatedly throughout the day. And one probably somewhat longer break so that we, um, for those of you for whom it works in terms of the schedule and your day, you can have a meal or take a walk or something like that and then come back. Okay, so the topic is real life, which is the title of a book I wrote some years ago. And the thesis of the book, it actually was based on an experience I had watching this online program. This is, of course, right in the height of the pandemic and isolation. And I watched this online program about a Seder, this Jewish ritual at Passover, this dinner, and which I'd grown up with. And in the program, which is very funny, by the way, it's called Saturday Night Seder. Uh, there was an explanation of the word Egypt, a definition of the word Egypt, because this is all a symbolic journey, which is from confinement, imprisonment, slavehood to freedom, to liberation. So the word Egypt, which is the starting point, literally means a narrow place, a place of constriction or constraint. And that's the journey. We move from constriction, tightness, not being able to breathe, being closed down, seeing no options, feeling imprisoned, to freedom. And within freedom, there's also a sense of connection rather than isolation. So that really fascinated me. And I thought, well, there's a book, there's a whole description of the path that we wish to join, we wish to be following, and really what it's like. There's so many states we might start out with or encounter along the way, which do feel like being locked in and locked down and imprisoned, and you can't breathe, and it's all uptight and narrow. And then there is the movement. Now, the movement, interestingly enough, the path is not to dismiss what may be coming up, say emotionally or in terms of thoughts or sensations in the body, but to relate to it differently. And in that different relationship comes the expansiveness, the ability to see options, to feel free. So it really intrigued me. It also, I started out in the book talking about a more current psychological description of the difference between a fixed mind state and a growth mind state. A fixed mind state being basically, here you are, you have a certain kind of conditioning. That's it. You can hide it or display it, but you're not going to change it. Whereas a growth mind state sees one's conditioning and recognizes, oh, I don't have to be defined by that. I don't have to be bound to that. It may come up because it's a habit, but it doesn't have to guide my life. It doesn't have to determine my choices. There are ways to seek change that are actually very effective. And that also reminded me of, for a long time, I've said, I'm far from a Buddhist scholar, but people have often asked me, what's your favorite passage from the Buddha? And I have one, which is the Buddha said, abandon that which is unwholesome or unskillful. Now, that which is unskillful or unwholesome, different habits of mind, for example, don't make us bad people, even if they come up a lot, but they cause suffering. They're states that in themselves are painful and often lead to more pain or causing pain as well. So that's what's unskillful or unwholesome. It's not a kind of prissy self-judgment, like I'm so unwholesome, But really, it's recognizing these are states of pain. So he said, abandon that which is unskillful. You can abandon the unskillful. If it were not possible, I would not ask you to do it. And he went on to say, if abandoning the unskillful would lead to, more suffering and distress, I would not ask you to do it. But because it leads to freedom, so I say, abandon that which is unskillful. And then the passage goes on to say, cultivate the good. You can cultivate the good. If it were not possible, I would not ask you to do it. So these are states that in their own nature are expansive, are opening, are connecting, are freeing. Cultivate the good. You can cultivate the good. If it were not possible, I would not ask you to do it. And if cultivating the good were to cause unhappiness, distress, suffering, I would not ask you to do it. But because cultivating the good brings freedom and happiness, so I say cultivate the good. No, I lived for a very long time in my early practice, buoyed up by, if it were not possible, I would not ask you to do it. And I used to think, Buddha thinks I can do it. Hey, look at that. I often wondered if I could do it, but look at that. The Buddha thinks I can do it. So this is, these descriptions of a path are very real. It's not abstract. It's not theoretical. There's another saying of the Buddha's where he said, I teach one thing and one thing only, that is suffering and the end of suffering. And one kind of witty friend of mine said, well, suffering and the end of suffering are two things. Why do they say they're one thing? Which is an interesting exploration. But it's basically this feeling that we have so much capacity, we have so much potential as a human being. It's really kind of breathtaking. And yet we can be so conditioned, we can be so deceived by the messages we've gotten, so lost in some way that we don't even recognize that we can bring an end to suffering, which does not mean, of course, needless to say, an end to painful experience. I mean, life is life. And there's a continual rotation of pleasure and pain and gain and loss and praise and blame and fame and disrepute, as the Buddha talked about the eight vicissitudes. This is reality. And yet, back to Passover for a moment, my friend Sylvia Borstein, my colleague, tells this story about her granddaughter, who was, I think, about 9 years old at the time, and they were preparing dinner for Passover, which has certain classical food elements, including this dish called gefilte fish, which you may not be familiar with. I told this story in Ireland and I had to annotate everything. So gefilte fish is this very strange sort of gelatinous mix of different kinds of fish ground up and made into a mold. And it's traditionally served with horseradish. So Sylvia said to her granddaughter, I want you to take a piece of fish, gefilte fish, put one on each plate with a big tablespoonful of horseradish. And Hope, who's her granddaughter, said, I never knew you could take something truly terrible and make it even worse. So Sylvia, in telling this story, hastens to add she makes very good gefilte fish. And I hasten to add that I really like horseradish. But nonetheless, the kind of basic lesson is that painful things can happen and we might be making them even worse. So you could say suffering is, but what we don't want is extra suffering. And there's a path to be able to breathe free, even when, life is disappointing or scary or something like that. Another way I sometimes approach it is in the ways of looking at stress. It's really a dynamic. There's the pressure, the incident, the circumstance, and then there's the resource with which it's met. And we know that from any day, an ordinary day, right? Like maybe you didn't sleep well last night and you had an argument with somebody over breakfast. And then you go to work or you go to school or you go to some gathering and you overhear this pretty distressing comment and you just take it to heart. It just pierces you and it's so painful. In contrast to you had a beautiful night's sleep and you had a lovely gathering of loving friends at breakfast. Then you go to this encounter and you overhear that same comment and you think, wow, person's having a really bad day. It's not like you cover it over and that was a lovely thing to say. Maybe it wasn't, but we relate so differently. And sometimes people hear that kind of description and they take it to mean that we never try to do anything to change a circumstance or affect a system or make for real change. And I don't think that's true at all. But what I usually say is why seek change from a place of maximum exhaustion and depletion and overwhelm? Why not build up a sense of resource within so that we can encounter difficulty differently? And in some ways, I would bet seek change more effectively because we don't feel so impoverished or undone inside, which is so tiring. So the path from narrowness, constraint, being overwhelmed to freedom and to openness is not through trying to abolish or dismiss or never having certain feelings, but being able to relate to them differently. And that's real, that's realistic. I was just talking to somebody this morning about my friend Bob Thurman, who is a professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia University. He's since retired, but we wrote a different book together called Love Your Enemies, which I can also talk about a little bit. But in sitting with Bob, sometimes co-teaching, and he would often use as a preferred translation the word realistic. And I would sit there and think, I don't know about that. That sounds a little boring, like why get up an hour earlier in the morning to be more realistic? But as I listened, I began to appreciate the term more because when we're not realistic, then we're living out of harmony with the truth. I have another mug. I don't have it here. I have it at home in Barry, which says something like banging your head against the wall is never fun. Um, so it's not fun to be unrealistic, to bang our heads against the wall, to live in defiance of certain truths like constant change, to hold on desperately, thinking we can be in control of what we can never control is not fun, really. So a realistic path is what we're really looking for, from narrowness to freedom. So we start often, well, let's go back to suffering and the end of suffering. It's not, I mean, a lot of people hear that and they think that's depressing. I once, so long ago, I was reading, I think it was New Yorker magazine, because there was an article about the Buddha and it said, the author said in the article, according to the Buddha, the purpose of life is to suffer. And I thought, well, that's kind of bleak, And it's also not true. It's not like the purpose of life is to suffer, but let's, again, be realistic. Let's look at the nature of things. There's pleasure and pain and gain and loss and praise and blame and fame and disrepute. This is just anyone's life. No one has only pleasure and no pain. No one has only gain or praise and no loss. It's just not life. And so how can we be free anyway? And I've often thought of um, the Buddha. First of all, it's taught certainly in Southern schools of Buddhism, which is where I did most of my training. It's taught that always that the Buddha was a human being. He wasn't some kind of supernatural being. He was a human being who had some very profound questions about life. Like, what does it mean to be born into a human body? To be an infant, so helpless to the actions and the reactions of those around you. What does it mean to grow up, to get older, to be vulnerable, to have sickness, to have old age, to die, whether we want to or not? And is there a way of a really profound kind of happiness, peace, harmony, even though the body does its own thing? And that doesn't mean we're helpless. Obviously, we can live in different ways, that will affect those things, but we're never going to be able to control it. Absolutely. And what does it mean to have a human mind with just like this cascade of emotions? We may wake up feeling afraid, and then we're confident, and then we're full of faith, and then we're full of doubt, and then we're angry, and then we're regretful, and just constantly coming and going. And again, is there a kind of happiness we can access that isn't going to be distorted, isn't going to be tossed around by all of these changing states? And it said that the answer, of course, that he came to is yes. We can access that kind of wellspring of happiness and peace. And there are methods, there are practices, there's a path. And just as he did, through the power of his own awareness, so can we. And that's really the adventure that we go on. That's the journey to discover our own innate abilities, to discover that movement, that flow, to learn how to recognize those forces that hold us down, constrict us, cause suffering, learn how to relate differently to them, learn how to appreciate and have more confidence in those forces that are expansive and opening, like loving kindness and compassion, and to have a much happier life. It's also coming to my mind to recognize that we have that kind of potential is the source of confidence. It doesn't mean that we're arrogant or, overlooking some very real issues we might be encountering, but it's like a fundamental belief that we can actually experience change and growth. So what just popped into my mind was this time in 1979. And Bob Thurman actually, the retreat center I co-founded is in Barre. It's a little town called Barre, Massachusetts. And Bob at the time was a professor at Amherst College, which is about 45 minutes away. And we heard that the Dalai Lama had been invited by Bob to Amherst. So we had founded the center in 1976. We just had our 50th anniversary. And this is 1979, so it's 45 minutes away, and we were very young and very bold. So we shot off a letter to the private office of the Dalai Lama and said, hey, you want to visit us too? We're only 45 minutes away. And much to our amazement, we got a letter back saying, yeah, he'd come. So that was a remarkable day, and there are lots of stories about that day. The security and everything was kind of wild. And we had a retreat that was happening, had been going on for about 2 weeks. And the Dalai Lama said at one point after the tour and after lunch, he said, I'd like to go into the meditation hall and give a talk. So this is his first trip to North America. So he had not quite encountered many layers of Western psychology at that point. So he went into the hall, he gave a talk, and then asked for questions. So there was this young man who'd been meditating for 2 weeks, who raised his hand and he said, I've been meditating for 2 weeks and I realized I can't do it. I can't make any progress. I can't learn. I can't grow. I don't have the capacity for love, for connection, for wisdom. And the Dalai Lama, this being his first trip to the West, was kind of like, huh? And then he said, well, you're wrong. You're just wrong. And he went on to say, from that point of view, from that philosophical point of view, everybody has the capacity for wisdom, for growth, for understanding, for freedom. It's a seed, it's like a seed form, they would call it Buddha nature. And as a potential, it is never, ever destroyed, no matter what we've gone through, no matter what we've done. It may be covered over, it usually is. It may be hidden, it may be hard to trust, but it's there. So the Dalai Lama couldn't quite comprehend what he was saying. He said, you're wrong. You're just wrong. And then he went on to talk about Buddha nature, how we all have this potential for freedom. And it was really funny because after the talk, all these people came up to me to complain about what the Dalai Lama said. And they said, well, that's bad pedagogy. You should never tell anyone that they're wrong. It's like that's a bad thing to say to someone. But who got a lot out of it was the young man. Turned out to be the perfect thing for him to hear. And just as a side note, there's another nonprofit called Dharma Seed, which started in the basement of IMS and recorded many, many talks, including that one from the Dalai Lama and the question and answer. You can just look up their website and it's all available for free or by donation. So I hadn't even realized that talk was there until I was looking for something else. And I went, oh, look at that. Okay, so we practice, or we even explore these things because of that sense of there is a potential for change. And we undertake the exploration to see both what binds us and what might free us in a realistic way. Classically, what binds us is usually referred to in terms of root issues or defilements as greed, hatred, and delusion, or grasping, aversion. Aversion is anger and fear, both. And then delusion. The word in Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, that's usually translated as defilement, is kilesa or kilesha. And it literally means torment of the mind. The word defilement, which is the conventional translation, does sound a little judgmental, like I'm so defiled. But it means torment of the mind. And that's something we can get behind, right? It doesn't mean the arising of something in our consciousness. It means when we latch onto it, when it gets kind of overwhelming, when it fills us, then it's tormenting. Then we're really suffering. I mean, think about a time you were really, really, really afraid, or really just so angry at yourself, you just hated yourself. Being filled with that is not really a good time, right? And it's very confusing. We don't remember change. We don't remember possibilities. We feel consigned to something. I was at somebody's memorial service about a year ago. And one of the things they did at the memorial service was play recordings of the deceased person. So you would hear these messages in his own voice. And one of the recordings started out with him saying I'm a meditator. And the meditation technique that I use is called mental noting. So mental noting is when, something arises and we just try, if the word comes easily, we place a label on it like joy, sorrow, anger, love, whatever. So this person said, I make a mental note of what I'm experiencing, and the goal is to name it before it names me. In other words, before it fills me, overcomes me, defines me, and most especially goads or sparks certain actions. We all know those times, right? When you're just like so angry and you say something and then you look back and you go, whoops. It used to be like in the olden days of email, for example, if I don't know, I used AOL, so I don't know if this was true for other platforms, but if you're the recipient of an email you'd written was also on AOL, and let's say you'd written this really angry, nasty email, and you sent it, and they hadn't read it yet, there was this magic button you could press called unsend. And if you pressed unsend, it like something reached out from your computer and pulled it back from theirs. And it's like it never was. So I once sent a friend, it wasn't a nasty, hostile email, but I regretted it after a while and she hadn't read it yet. So I unsent it. And she wrote to me and said, the weirdest thing just happened. I was looking at my screen and I could have sworn there was an email from you and it just disappeared. And I wrote back and I said, that's so strange. I don't know how that could be. But life doesn't always offer us that many unsend buttons. And we might want to know what we're feeling as we're feeling it, not after we've sent the email. We might want to make choices, not only recognizing the emotion, but also with some clarity, some wisdom, some compassion for ourselves and for someone else, whatever values we want to bring forth before we send the email. So we want to name our emotion before it names us. And we're going to go into various things that bind us, various things that free us, and really make that exploration. Okay, so let's sit together some. Can sit comfortably. The goal in so many ways and so many levels is balance. And they say right away there's some balance in our bodies and our posture. If you're sitting, it's fine to lie down as well. But if you're sitting, see if your back can be straight without being strained or overarched. You want some energy in your body, but not like so much energy you're really uptight. You also want to be relaxed and at ease, but not like so relaxed that you're way slumped over. So you see if you can find your way into what feels like a balanced posture to you. And you can close your eyes or keep them slightly open. And it's fine to change midway. You may start with your eyes closed and decide for whatever reason to open them. It's fine. And we're going to start by listening to sound. Could be the sound of my voice or other sounds. It's a way of relaxing deep inside. Allowing our experience to come and go. Of course, we like certain sounds and we don't like others, but we don't have to chase after them to hold on or push away. Let them come, let them go. If you're not responsible for responding to the sound, you can just let it wash through you. Bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. See if you can feel the earth supporting you. See if you can feel space touching you. Most of the time, we think about touching space. We think about picking up a finger and poking it in the air, but space is already touching us. It's always touching us. We just need to receive it. Bring your attention to your hands and see if you can make the shift from the more conceptual level, like go fingers, to the world of direct sensation, picking up pulsing, throbbing, pressure, whatever it might be. You don't need to name these things, but feel them. And on that same level of feeling sensation, see if you can bring your attention to the feeling of your breath. Just the normal, natural breath, wherever you feel it most strongly. Nostrils, chest, or abdomen. You can find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the very next breath, just this one. And if you like, you can use a quiet mental notation of in, out, or rising, falling to help support the awareness of the breath, but very quiet. So your attention is really going to feeling the breath, one breath at a time. If images or sounds or sensations or emotions should arise, but they're not very strong, if you can stay connected to the feeling of the breath, just let them flow on by. You're breathing. It's just one breath. If they are strong, though, something arises, see if you can just gently place a mental label on it. There's joy, there's sorrow, whatever it might be. You can note it, then see if you can let go. Return your attention to the feeling of the breath. If it's too hard to let go, that's fine. Stay with it. Keep noting it. Try again to see if you can return to the breath. And for all those perhaps many times you are just gone, completely lost in thought, swept up in a fantasy, or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. You can realize you've been gone, see if you can let go, and begin again. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation. So thank you for that. I've often said that my favorite example of mindfulness as a quality, that ability to recognize, say, what we're feeling, what's predominant in the present moment, without getting kind of sunk into it and overcome by it on the one hand, or ashamed of it, pushing it away on the other. It's a place in the middle. So I've often described my favorite example of that as coming from uh, years ago. I read an article in the New York Times about a very early pilot project bringing mindfulness into the classroom. So this was a fourth grade classroom in Oakland, California. And the journalist asked one of the kids, so he's in fourth grade, so he's like 9 or 10 years old. The journalist asked, well, what is mindfulness? And the kid said, mindfulness means not hitting someone in the mouth. That's what mindfulness means. And I thought, that's a great example. Because what does it imply? It implies knowing we're feeling angry when we're starting to feel angry, not after we've sent the email or, we've exploded in some way. It also implies a certain balanced relationship to the anger. If like we get overcome by all of these feelings and we have no space, we're likely to hit a lot of people in the mouth because life can be very frustrating. But on the other hand, if we're ashamed of what we're feeling and we're upset about it and we try to hide it, we try to stuff it down, we get tighter and tighter and tighter until we explode. It just doesn't work. So we say mindfulness is this place in the middle where we can connect to what's happening, we can recognize it, not getting overcome by it, not pushing it away. And in that way of relating, there is space, there's openness. And in that space, maybe options arise we hadn't seen before for ways to act or respond. Creativity can arise. Like I like to think of that kid thinking, hit someone in the mouth last week, didn't work out that well. Maybe I'll try using my words or something like that. So it's not that we never respond, but we don't have to be driven to the same old reaction. And that also reminds me of the story my friends at the Holistic Life Foundation told me, where they teach yoga and meditation in inner city schools in Baltimore. And they talked about this one young girl, I think younger, maybe like 7 years old, who was often teased by the other kids, and she would fight back. She would like knock kids out and then end up in detention. So they taught her some tools, and they said they walked into some public space like the cafeteria or the auditorium one day, and she had this other little girl holding her by the throat up against the wall. And then she looked at her and she said, you're just lucky I know how to meditate. And she dropped her. And she went off into a corner and like composed herself and whatever. And I've seen, like, because now I've been very occasionally like zooming into a school with Kind Carl, the book, and a fifth grade classroom. Those kids have an app, they're meditating, or a first grade classroom, they've got a corner when they're freaked out. They can go and kind of um, center, and calm down and then act, speak to somebody or say their piece or something like that. So Mindfulness is like that place in the middle. We can recognize that this is what I'm feeling, and let's just breathe for a moment, see what comes, things like that. They say, and many of you are probably familiar with five hindrances that so often arise in meditation practice. The roots of that are these three defilements, or klesa, torments of the mind that give rise to those five. And that's sometimes described as greed, hatred, delusion, or grasping, aversion, and delusion. And what those lists are about is that when we don't have a mindful relationship to those states, when they suck us in or we get overwhelmed by them, when they define us, then those are some of the most binding states, constricting states, hopeless feeling states, like we're just sunk, we're stuck there. That can be, and that those are the roots of those states. So greed or grasping has a lot of different manifestations. One of the things I say sometimes in describing my earliest practice was that one of the reasons it was very difficult for me to just be with the breath was I came to see that as soon as this breath was arising, I would kind of mentally lean forward to be ready for the next 50 breaths. I was very frightened. I was very wary. I didn't know what might happen next. I felt like I had to be ready for it. And so that leaning forward can be fear, can also be grasping. I've got to get it right, I've got to be ready. I've got to be here. I've got to accumulate. Like, what if they ask how many breaths I can be with before my mind wanders? I've got to be able to. And so I used to say to myself things like, settle back, let the breath come to you. I also used to say, you're breathing anyway. All you need to do is feel it, because I had so much performance anxiety. It's like I'd never taken a breath before. So all of that forward leaning is a manifestation of a kind of grasping. I once, I was teaching very close to here at this place called Tibet House, which is really like an art gallery and also has these programs. So I was teaching there, and I did an out loud meditation on greed. So there's an art gallery, so there are all these paintings, and Tanka's I have one over there, but I don't think you can see it. It's a Tibetan scroll-like painting, usually with brocade as a kind of frame. So this was my out loud meditation on greed or grasping. I saw this tanka, this scroll, off in the corner, and I couldn't see the price tag, but I saw it, so I was saying out loud, oh, I really like that. I think it's beautiful. I want it. Okay, I'm going to buy it. And then I remembered, oh, well, I was living in a rented apartment that was teeny tiny at the time, and I also wasn't allowed to put anything up on the walls. So I thought, or I said out loud, okay, I'm going to get a new apartment. I'm going to buy the scroll. I'm going to get a new apartment, and it's going to be a bigger apartment so that the scroll can have like its own room, and I can get lights, and it'll be really perfect, and I'll have a room. And then I remembered and I said, oh, to afford a bigger apartment, even more rent in New York City, I'm going to have to just be traveling on the road all the time and teaching and getting enough money to pay the rent. I will never see the scroll. I'll never be in my apartment, but you know what? I'll own it. So that was like my example of a grasping mind, right? We want something, becomes singular. We can't imagine being happy without it. We're not looking at what we might lose in order to attain it or obtain it. We're not looking at what we might compromise in order to obtain it. It's just that kind of leaning forward. I've got to have it. And we miss so much. It's like me with that brilliant white light when I could have been appreciating even the painful things that were happening because they were big awakenings and openings for me, but certainly the lovely things that were happening, but that were not white light. But nothing was good enough because it wasn't that one thing I had set my heart on. So that's like the limiting nature of grasping. It's not like we're bad people for having it, or experiencing it. But let's look with some kind of honesty and self-scrutiny at what are the consequences of that just being habitual. They say in the teachings that the best kind of generosity comes from some sense of inner abundance, or at least inner sufficiency. Because no matter how much you have materially, externally, if you don't ever have an internal feeling of ever having enough, it's just that much harder to give, right? This is why we see certainly in many cultures or uh, many strata of society, sometimes people with very little, relatively speaking, externally, are incredibly generous, right? And it's not like an obligation, it's really a kind of joy to share and to give. It's coming from someplace inside. It's different than feeling I never have enough and I need more and I need to accumulate. I'll never be safe unless I keep accumulating and all the things that we might be taught. So what binds us and what frees us is up to us. And we have this incredible opportunity through mindfulness to really pay attention. So that's grasping, and then there's hatred or anger. Aversion is the most comprehensive way of saying it. In the Buddhist psychology, anger and fear are the same mind state. Anger being the outflowing, expressive form, fear being the held in, frozen form. Of striking out against what's happening, wanting to declare it to be untrue. And again, it's not wrong to feel anything, whatever we might feel, but when we are enveloped in certain states, when they're really kind of chronic or overwhelming, then we have to see what the consequences might be. With anger, the Buddha said, and again, this is not a mindful recognition that we're feeling anger. This is being overcome by anger. The Buddha said that anger is like a forest fire which can burn up its own support, which means it devastates the host, which is us, our bodies, our nervous system, our relationships, our families. And like a forest fire, it might burn really wild and free and leave us in a place very far from where we want to be. But that's not a call for, complacency or passivity or never doing anything or taking a stand or having a boundary or anything like that. It's a very particular state, which is it is a kind of burning. And it may be compelling and useful as a goad to action, but what happens when it becomes a more perpetual state? What happens? Just take a look. I mean, for one thing, what I've seen, well, like right now, just bring up a time you were really, really angry at yourself, like really angry. Just bring it up right now. What does it feel like? Is it also a time where you remember, I did 5 good things that same morning? I said that stupid thing. No, those 5 good things, they're gone. It is that fire. I'm so stupid. I'm so bad. I'm so awful. Nobody loves me. I will always be this way. I don't deserve to be loved, whatever it might be. So I often tell the story about way back in the early days of email when you would hear that sound like you've got mail and it was so exciting, like, wow, I've got mail, not like now. But it was really thrilling, like, wow, I've got mail. So I was working in Barrie on my desktop, and I heard that sound, that magical sound. So I got online, and it was somebody writing to me saying, I don't see what the problem is with anger. I just don't see it. So I wrote back to him, again, making the distinction between feeling anger and being overwhelmed by anger, and said, when we're lost in anger, then we just put people in a box. Then I got offline and I went back to what I was working on. And something went terribly wrong in the relationship between my computer and my printer, and I got really angry. The first person I was really furious at was, we didn't even have the phrase IT way back then. We called him our computer assistant. I was really, really angry at the guy who was our computer assistant, who was on vacation in Hawaii. Like, in my rage, totally overlooking the fact that the reason he was on vacation was because I thought he needed a vacation. And the reason he was in Hawaii is because I had gone to the airport, which is what you had to do in those days, to use my frequent flyer miles to get him a ticket to go to Hawaii. It's like all that was gone. He's never here when I need him. Why can't he be here? He's so terrible. The next person I was really angry at was myself. I was down on my hands and knees, pulling out plugs and putting in plugs, trying to fix it. And I was really angry at myself. Why can't you be the kind of person who can never fix anything? You're so inept. You should have learned how to deal with this. You never did. But in the meantime, I fixed it, and I hardly took a moment, to feel like grateful. I got back up on my chair and I was working on the project, and I heard that magical sound again. So I went online, and there was my original correspondent saying, I don't understand what you mean by saying when we're lost in anger, we just put people in a box. And I said, well, this is what just happened. I put this guy in a box, as the great betrayer. He is never here, ever, when I need him. I put myself in a box. You are so klutzy and stupid. You can't do anything, right? So there was a perfect example. We just lose so much information and so much of a sense of possibility. So the other form of anger is fear. So let's talk a little bit more about anxiety, which is kind of a more free floating. It's not necessarily a specific fear of a certain thing happening, but it's here to quote my friend Sylvia Borstein, who describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer. Sylvia says she was the kind of person who she's turning 90 in July. She would call one of her adult children and they wouldn't answer the phone. So, well, they must be dead. It had never occurred to me they're taking a shower, or they fell in love. They don't want to talk to their mother. And she was so distraught and her nervous system was so shot that that's when she got into meditation practice, because she needed some tools to help her deal with it. Does she have some of the same thoughts? I'd say, yeah. She relates to them very, very differently. There's so much more space in her ability to see something. And she also says, by the way, in an actual crisis, she's as steady as a rock. It's only in that imagined, projected scenario that she gets really overwrought. So here, we come back to the thoughts are not the problem, it's the glue. She's learned, and it's a training, it's practice and practice, not to take those thoughts so to heart, to hold them in a certain light, to see them and question, is it true? It's real in that it's arising, but is it true? And my Tibetan teacher, Sonny Rinpoche, will often tell a story about just that. He was, I think it was Malaysia. It was uh, these two unthinkably tall buildings that were connected by skyway very high up, going from one building to another. And it turned out he's afraid of heights somewhat. So he was with like a companion. They were at one end, and the companion just walked across. He was in the other building. And Sun Rinpoche would take a few steps and he would freak out. He just couldn't go further. And he'd just retreat. And he'd look at like whole groups of tourists or families going across, and he would try to talk himself out of the feeling and say, well, that's like five people. I'm just one person. It didn't collapse under them. It's not going to collapse under me. And he would take a few steps, couldn't do it. And he would retreat. And his friend was like waving to him from the other end. And he thought he was going to have to go down in the elevator all the way down and cross the street and go all the way up because he just couldn't do it. And then he took a few steps and he reflected the thoughts, the feelings are real and that they're happening, but are they true? And he realized something could be real, but not true. And then he could walk across. So, in effect, that's what Sylvia did. She forgave herself for what she was feeling. It's real, it's coming up. It's a very old conditioning. But it isn't necessarily true. So she had so much more space around those thoughts and feelings instead of being caught in them and locked in and constricted, remembering narrowness to freedom. So I asked her, she told me a couple of years ago that she had a new mantra, she had a new saying that she used. And I said, what is it? And she said, not every bus ends up in a ditch. So that's pretty good. And especially, I mean, you through past experience, the biology, there are lots of reasons one could be wired that way. Can we forgive ourselves for what we're feeling, but have enough space to say, is this true? Um, and then we have the energy to go on one way or another. I guess in some situations we do choose to go down in the elevator and cross the street. We also have techniques like the breath, which are actually very impactful. So I once, one of the communities that I've gotten to work with have been survivors of gun violence, and we had a retreat in Barrie one year, and there were a number of people there who were teachers who had been witness to school shootings, and which is, of course, extremely terrible. And the retreat ended on, well, the primary word that was most appreciated in the retreat was tools. People just wanted some tools to deal with their experience, to deal with what they were feeling. And so the retreat ended on a Sunday, and these particular teachers flew back to Florida, to Parkland, and went to work the next day, and there was a drill. So this one teacher said she had a panic attack and she was doubled over in a closet. And she couldn't get out of the closet. Because you can imagine that's a very re-traumatizing event. And then she remembered some of the tools and she began that kind of conscious breathing. And it helped a lot. She could get up, straighten up, she could get out of the closet. She could deal more effectively with what she was feeling. And so those are really an option. And I'd also say a very significant thing in a kind of narrowing, constricting state, when possible, is not to feel so alone. And especially if you can help somebody else in some way, because any act of generosity or kindness or service kind of brings us to a place inside of us that's not so overcome or feeling so broken. So also back in the beginning of the pandemic, I spent February, as I think I said, of 2020, mostly in California, wandering around teaching. Then I flew back to New York City. And New York in early March of 2020 was a very, very anxious, difficult place. Uh, Most of people's parents, like in nursing homes, were starting to get sick and maybe dying. There was a lot of confusion and uncertainty about the virus. There was a tremendous amount of fear. I was teaching in a completely windowless room down in the basement of some place, and you could tell people were so freaked out, about being there and but just getting there. There was so much unknown and people really dying, and it was the kind of place where the speaker would sit in the front row until they were formally introduced and then get up on stage. So sitting next to this woman, and she was really, really, really anxious. So I said, well, there are these breathing techniques that I've seen to be quite helpful, kind of calming the nervous system. And she wasn't interested. So I said, well, there's loving kindness practice, which we're going to talk about a little later, which is really about this feeling of connection, and it's very healing. She wasn't interested. So then I just looked at her and I said, is there anyone you can help? And she lit up and she said, well, I have this elderly neighbor and I could slip a note under their door and ask them if they want me to shop for groceries for them. And I thought, look at that. It's not to say that those other tools or techniques are not useful. They can be very useful. But in some circumstances, just feeling we have something to give, that there is something intact within us is actually the most opening, connecting thing that we can do. Grasping, aversion, of anger or fear. And then there's delusion, which has many forms. There's just confusion, being spaced out, being numb, not really clear about what we're feeling, about what's going on. There's being lost, like maybe in a world of projection. In India, there's a very famous example of seeing a rope coiled on the ground and mistaking it for a snake. And sometimes we're so triggered or we're so lost in a situation, we're not really grounded. We don't feel clear about what's happening and what's not happening. It's a kind of delusion. Like I thought of this time when I was teaching a loving kindness weekend, non-residential weekend in New York City. So everyone was going home at night and then coming back the next day. And this woman came in the morning and she was talking about this experience she had on a train platform the night before. I don't think it was a subway, I think it was a train. And she said this man started to approach her and she got very uneasy. She thought, oh, he looks really weird. And then he started asking her something about the train schedule, and she was so flustered that she said, I don't know anything about the train schedule. And she just pointed to this other woman on the platform and said, go ask her. And he said, oh, I can't ask her. She looks really weird. And I thought, well, how are we going about this life, just lost in this world of projection? So that's a kind of delusion, when we are making assumptions about others, we're not really kind of paying attention and open and checking things out. And I'll also say there's the opposite sort of delusion where there's a snake on the ground and we think, oh, that's just a piece of rope. That we need a better sense of boundaries. We need more clarity about taking care of ourselves. And that can happen too. And it actually literally happened to me in Burma once, where the Western women were staying in this dormitory, which was down a hill. And there was like a staircase cut into the hill, pretty steep hill. And I was up on top. It was, I don't know, the meditation hall was up there and where the teachers were, if you were talking to somebody that was up there. So it was like dusk. And I was going back to my room and I was at the top of the staircase and I saw like this little green thread, on one of the stairs, and I thought nothing of it. But all these Burmese women were around and I didn't speak any Burmese and they didn't speak any English, but they were gesturing wildly toward me. They wouldn't let me go down the stairs. And I had to scramble down this very steep embankment. It turned out, of course, it wasn't like a little green piece of string. It was an extremely venomous snake that they were protecting me from. That can happen too, So in both cases, we want to be as grounded as we can, to pay attention, not to be lost in assumption, and to really let that attention guide us and reveal whatever we need. There's also a kind of delusion, which is just ignorance. What do we believe? What do we hold as a North Star? Where do we feel happiness really resides? They say, in Buddhism that everybody wants to be happy. We all want not just endless pleasure or being happy-go-lucky, but a deep sense of belonging, of feeling at home somewhere in this body, in this mind, with one another on this planet. And it's ignorance that leads us astray. Or as one of my friends once put it, bad aim. We have bad aim. And what are we taught, really? Maybe usually we're taught endless accumulation will keep us happy and keep us safe from change, even safe from death in some weird way. We're taught, and this is, probably my favorite one, it's a dog eat dog world. Don't help anybody else because they're not going to help you. And just do whatever you need to do to get ahead. Doesn't matter. And look how lonely it leaves us. That sort of endless sense of being competitive when, I mean, in some cases we are applying for the same job or something, but a lot of times it's not true. And at any rate, we live in an interdependent world. It's simply not true that you're on your own and no one's helping you in any way. I once was co-teaching this 6-day seminar, and I used that example in the opening night. It's a dog eat dog world. And this young woman raised her hand and she said, I never knew that was the saying. She said, I always thought it was a doggy dog world, like puppies jumping up and down in meadows. And she said, what a terrible saying. And then 6 days later, it was the closing circle, and she raised her hand and she said, I'm not going to live in a dog eat dog world. I'm going to live in a doggy dog world. But what do we believe? What do we cherish? What's our North Star? What guides us? What's our strongest aspiration? Where do we think happiness is? And if we find that that's very conditioned, we see if we can let it go and explore, is it really true that the sort of endless vengefulness is making me strong? is it true that, you know how we can get obsessed with somebody's actions and we just go over it and over it and over it and over it? And that's different than a kind of clear-eyed recognition of what we feel about how they're behaving. We just go over it and over it and over it and over it. Whereas one friend of mine said he would describe himself as a sort of obsessive type, where he does exactly that, you know, whether it's a world figure or someone who he more directly knows that he feels is causing harm. And I think it's an AA saying, he said, I realized I let him live rent free in my brain for too long. You know, so what happens when someone takes over in that way? We're not really very happy, but we may be taught that that's strength. You know, I'm not going to let them get away with it somehow. But is it really? Or many of us are taught that compassion is just stupid. You know, where you add a term like loving kindness, which doesn't mean anything in conventional society, you know, or love. And it just seems like, uh, you know, that's weakness, that's sentimentality, that's uh, people taking advantage of you. But is it? You know, when you Google a term, um, Google, I don't even know in these days of AI, but you know, in the old days, Google would offer you uh, the thing they think you're searching for because so many people have searched for that very thing so often. So if you put in compassion, it'll come back with fatigue because so many people have looked for compassion fatigue. Like, what is it? And that's our association rather than compassion as a strength, you know, as a power. But is it really weakness? So these are the, you know, that's the opportunity we have to really take a look, not just to believe kind of the myths and legends we've been told, but really how do you have a happy life? And that also brings me to the sense of the second arrow, you know, which again is that parable where we are hurting in some way. And we think that the very thing we're doing is gonna, with that second arrow, is somehow gonna relieve the pain. But in fact, it makes it worse. So let's take a look. You know, what about relating differently? What happens when I practice mindfulness? It's up to us, you know, we're not compelled to, but that's an interesting experiment. And then what happens when I practice self-compassion? You know, even just any exercise that we do, like being with, let's say, the breath. It's usually not 800 breaths before your mind wanders, right? So how do you speak to yourself when you realize you've been gone or you've fallen asleep? And if you just kind of jump on a train of really harsh self-judgment, what happens? We've extended the period of the distraction, sometimes considerably, and it's so exhausting. It's so fatiguing that we're just kind of overcome. We don't feel any resilience. We don't feel the sense I can start over or move on. And this is something that we can directly observe. What happens when you kind of give yourself a break? Your mind has wandered. Minds wander. Kind of pick yourself up. You have resilience. You start over. What's the consequence of that? And so we have every ability to see for ourselves what is constricting and narrowing and imprisoning, and what actually is freeing and opening. So there was a question about doubt. Um, And then I want to move on to those states and practices that are expansive and opening and connecting in the journey from isolation to freedom, like loving kindness and compassion and so on. So, first, doubt. Doubt is an interesting state in the Buddhist psychology. Can't hear me, can't hear who. Um, because it can mean many different things. I'm audible, that's great. Um, and there's a kind of doubt in the Buddhist psychology that's considered very positive and very important, and that is based on the Buddha saying, don't believe anything. Don't believe anything because I said it. Don't believe anything because a great elder has said it. Don't believe anything because it will be written in a sacred text. Put it into practice. See for yourself what's true. And I always thought of that as a kind of breathtaking view of human potential instead of saying, follow me and do whatever I ask and don't ever question. The Buddha is very into questioning and wondering and investigating and finding out for yourself. And that's pretty great, really. It's very interesting too. But it has to be the right kind of doubt, um, where there's a sincerity in our effort. We do put something into practice. We're willing to maybe step out of our comfort zone, see for ourselves if it's true. And that's different from different kinds of doubt, what we might call cynicism these days, where we don't bother to put something into practice. We've already decided it doesn't work or it doesn't work for me, which is often a kind of disguised fear. Like, I don't know if it can work for me, so I better say it's not worth doing. The illustration I like a lot, which I use all the time, is as you know, they say the Buddha was enlightened sitting under a tree, and then he spent 49 days in the vicinity of the tree before he walked to a nearby town and gave his first teaching. So in those 49 days, he spent 7 days each doing 7 different activities. He did walking meditation for 7 days. He happily pondered the truth of the law of dependent origination for 7 days. So at the end of 49 days, he got up and he walked to this town. So this is just 49 days after his great enlightenment. And one can assume he was like pretty radiant. And the first person he came upon was this merchant who they say was very struck by that radiance and said to the Buddha, like, who are you? Like, what are you? Are you some kind of celestial being? Are you a human being? Like, what are you? And it said that the Buddha said in response, I'm awake. I'm an awakened one. And the guy said, maybe, and he walked away. So imagine him staying. Like, I call that walk away doubt, but imagine him instead staying and saying, well, that's an outrageous thing to say. Like, what does it mean to be awake? And are you the only one who can be awake? Could I be awake too? What would it take? And that's a different kind of questioning, rather than just walking away. So there's a kind of doubt that has us retreat and not try and uh, not give something a chance to see if it speaks to us, if we find it helpful. And it's not that helpful kind of doubt. There's also a kind of doubt that has us stuck. It's speculative. It's like in my earliest practice, all of my teachers, for example, were either Burmese or had practiced in Burma, studied in Burma. And then, I was living in India and I got very drawn to this Tibetan teacher who was in this other place in India. So it was very different style of practice, different metaphysics. And when I would sit down to meditate, rather than meditate, I would think, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? Should I do that? Which one's faster? Which one's better? Well, those people seem more enlightened than these people, but then I know these people not as well as I know those people, and maybe they wouldn't seem so enlightened, which should I do? Should I do this? Should I do that? So in effect, I was doing absolutely nothing. And I finally said to myself, just do something. Doesn't have to be a lifetime commitment, but rather than just speculate, and live in abstraction, take a breath, be mindful, do something. And that was really crucial, to sort of get me out of my head and into actual practice. Because in the end, it's our own practice that is most important. Just like the Buddha had those questions about the nature of life, so can we. And so understanding what kind of doubt we're experiencing, it's never wrong to ask a question and try to clarify something, to put something into practice and see for yourself. The problem with doubt is that it doesn't usually arrive with a little sign that says, I'm doubt. It usually arrives with a sign that says, I'm the smartest thought you've ever had. Get out of here. So we do need some discernment and ability to really look at what we're experiencing and then decide. It's not that we have to keep doing something for the rest of our lives if we feel it's not helpful at all. We're not stuck. But again, it's like when I said earlier, the benefit of practice is not going to be revealed necessarily in what we experience sitting every day or however often we sit. It's going to be revealed in our lives. So you don't want to look in the wrong place, and then give something up that's really very helpful, perhaps. So learning and studying and understanding is always a good thing. Somebody's asking, there's so many different kinds of meditation, which is like my lead-in for loving kindness. Can you tell me the difference? How long and how many times we should meditate per day? So there are many different kinds of meditation. In a broader way than we're going to cover here, there are meditation. Well, we did some walking meditation. There's sitting meditation. There are meditations off the cushion. I suggested a little bit of that in just a few minutes to do an exercise. Some people don't sit formally, but they do practice like having a mindful meal or with loving kindness. One example would be doing loving kindness walking down the street, and we'll talk about that. You don't slow down, you don't look weird, but you're offering phrases of loving kindness as you're walking. Or I have a friend who said when she's in a Zoom session and she sees all these little boxes with faces in them, she'll offer loving kindness to one person at a time silently. May you be happy, be happy, be happy. It's sort of like, it's what one teacher calls short moments many times. So that's a way of practice. In terms of formal, like sitting practice, even within like Southern Buddhism, there are different ways of emphasis. You can emphasize mindfulness, you can emphasize loving kindness. Most people I know do some of each. No, they're not antithetical to one another, they're just different styles. There are also practices, people do chanting, which would be out loud, or instead of the breath, settling their attention on a mantra, like a repeated saying or an image. There's so many possibilities. The way I really was taught was using the breath and the body as a kind of base, then paying attention with mindfulness to emotions. That's the labeling. Instead of like, I'm such an angry person and I always will be, it's like, oh, there's anger. What does it feel like? Um, and then loving kindness, which is its own distinct sort of style, which we're going to get into. In terms of how long to practice, I think it's an interesting question. I often these days quote my friend Amishi Jha, who's a neuroscientist. Well, I could quote Richie Davidson too, who's another neuroscientist. But Amishi has a lab at the University of Miami, and she studies meditation, mostly mindfulness, a little bit of loving kindness in high stress professions, people in high stress professions like the military, high performance athletes, first responders. And what she says is that what she has found is that a 12-minute session of formal practice 3 to 5 times a week is actually changing people's lives. And because we're friends, I tease her. I say, I don't know if it's that healthy to go for the bare minimum. And she says, I was looking for the bare minimum. It's like in medicine, the lowest effective dose. Like, how much aspirin do you need to take, to deal with a headache? And she said, these really busy people, and she said, clearly, if you do more, there will be more benefit, but you can do just this, and it will be a pretty profound benefit. I also say to her, in all honesty, like when you're dealing with a structure, a recommended structure of practice, you also need self-understanding. And so I say to her, for me, I don't know that 3 to 5 times a week would work because it'll be Monday and I'll think, I'll start on Wednesday. It'll be Wednesday and I'll think, I'll do it 3 times on Saturday and I'll never do it. But every day would actually work for me. It's not like 15 hours a day. You don't have to sit in a pretzel-like pose. You could be comfortable. But for me, the everydayness of some formal practice is useful. One of the kids, actually, when I was zooming into the high school class, said to me, do you really have to practice formally, or can you just take these values and like the ethics of it and bring it to life? And I said, you don't have to practice formally, but it's like, are you going to remember, in a complex situation or there's some conflict, or are you going to remember to like actively listen or whatever the value is that you want to bring into life? But if you've practiced a few minutes in that morning, you're more likely to remember in a more complicated, intense, or varied situation. And so I have a kind of bias toward it because I think it's like going to the gym, which will stand you in good stead. It's also true. I was once interviewed, ironically enough, if you could really see my house, for Good Housekeeping magazine. And they ended up not using, which sometimes happens, not using my comments in the interview. But the question was, how do you practice mindfulness in a time of like intense crisis? And my response was, I wouldn't wait. Or ordinary or a little bit stressful, but not overwhelmingly so. It's like building up the muscle memory, it's building up the strength and the resilience, not to proliferate so much, not to react so much, but be present with what you're feeling. You're building up that strength so that when the bottom falls out, should it, and it often does in life, you've got it. You're not like, and it's not, I mean, some people do start in a time of intense crisis, and I think, does give them uh, some skills and is helpful, but it's hard. Why not start and build up a practice in more ordinary times? Because it will be there for you in more and more difficult times. It's also, you don't have to sit in a really uncomfortable way. You don't have to stress. Uh, Usually people these days, we used to say set an alarm. These days, there's so many apps that have chimes and bells, and you can choose the sound you want to end your sitting with and the timing, which is good because then you're not worried all the time. Like, am I over sitting? Am I sitting too long? And looking at your watch constantly if you have one. And which technique to use, you can experiment. You could see what you want to do. Again, it doesn't have to be a lifetime commitment. It could be something that you want to do and try out, for some weeks. And as I said, most people I know will have more than one practice that they ultimately pursue, some kind of mindfulness or awareness practice, some kind of loving kindness or compassion building practice, and that's really fine. And then I would add, those moments, because they are fun, and then they're also ways of somebody's asking about doing mindfulness, doing various tasks. Um, it's useful, instead of, I mean, sometimes it's when we're doing those tasks that we worry the most, or, just those old habits come up because we're not really paying attention. Usually the easiest thing is mindfulness of the body. It sounds simplistic or even reductionistic, but it actually works. Feel the broom in your hand. I've had one teacher said to me once, every time your hands are in water, try to be mindful. Because the body is the most accessible, it's the least strain, and the um, ability to kind of just be present is easiest. And so that they say, that's where the Buddha started with mindfulness of the body. And those are the kinds of instructions, honestly, both, sit and feel your breath, which was my first formal meditation instruction. And then even things like feel your feet against the ground. When I went to India, I would think that is so stupid, like where I wanted something a lot fancier and a lot more elaborate and esoteric and weird. But in the actual doing of it, it works. And for daily activity, when we're not always alone, and private and simple, it's right there. Nobody has to know you're doing it when you're with a crowd of people and someone's freaking out and you're getting anxious and you start breathing consciously. You don't have to close your eyes and look weird. You've got it. You've got a tool, you've got a resource right there. Okay, there are open eye meditation and closed eye meditation. What's the difference? Um, there are different schools that emphasize different things. In the end, it's usually a question of balance. So, for example, in any meditation technique, where um, developing different qualities and ultimately bringing them into balance. So, for example, the story I usually tell, or we usually tell, is when Joseph and I met in India, and we each came back at somewhat different times in 1974. Jack Cornfield was having a parallel life in Thailand and came back also like around that same time. And we began teaching, and ultimately, within a year or two, we were looking for property to open a retreat center. Someone else suggested that we do that. And they said to us, the people who can help you are all in Massachusetts, which turned out to be true. And so we came to the East Coast eventually and kept looking for a place. And um, in 1975 or so, somebody suggested at the time the Catholic Church was selling a lot of properties. We were in the midst of what we quaintly called the gas crisis, where heating a facility was getting really expensive, and some of these Catholic, like novitiates and places like that, were not attracting all that many novices, and it was expensive to heat the buildings, so they were consolidating. And someone suggested that we go to Barre, Massachusetts, where there was a novitiate for sale. So we went to Barre in like December of 1975, and we couldn't decide what to do. On the one hand, it seemed like a perfect place for a retreat center. It's very quiet and placid, not much happening in the town of Barre. And on the other hand, it seemed really big. We looked at that building, it sleeps like 100 people. And we thought, how many people in this country are going to want to learn how to meditate, or do this style of meditation? And so we couldn't decide what to do. So we went to downtown Barre for lunch. And Barre is a very classical New England town, which has a town green in the center of it. And in those days, there was a monument on the town green which had the Barre town motto engraved on it. The Barre town motto is tranquil and alert. So we took a look at that and we decided that was an omen. Any town that had a motto like tranquil and alert should have a meditation center in it. We bought it. And that's because those represents the kinds of qualities we're always talking about developing and bringing into balance. We're deepening calm, tranquility, peace, letting go, relaxation. And we're also strengthening energy and alertness and connection, right? We don't just want to get so calm that we just sleep. So we talk about deepening both sides and bringing them into balance. Anxiety, by the way, is considered, they don't pathologize it. It's just it's considered a state where there's like way too much energy for the amount of calm in one system. And so it's considered to be something out of balance, and they just work with bringing it into balance. So we decided to buy the place, and it's still the Barre Town motto, and I really enjoy that. Like, I think we have two police cars, and it says tranquil and alert. And this couple got married actually in my living room, and that's what's stamped on their marriage certificate, tranquil and alert, which I think is a pretty good blessing for a marriage. Um, so that's what we're doing. And all the methods and all the styles ultimately are about deepening both those sides of things and bringing them into balance. Um, and that's the work. Sometimes we're wired in a certain way. We tend to have more energy than calm, or we tend to have more calm than energy. And so, a particular phase of practice might be like I, for example, would have much more calm than energy. And so walking meditation might be a little harder for me, more challenging, but it's also really good because it brings up energy. Um, so all of that is the background for eyes open or eyes closed. Sitting with your eyes closed will tend to deepen calm. Sitting with your eyes open will tend to strengthen energy. Some schools only recommend one or the other, and so you kind of make up the balance in another way. It also could be that, maybe your thoughts are like way too jarring to sit with your eyes closed at a certain time, and that's fine. You can open your eyes and have kind of more of a sense of like being grounded and present. So the goal is always balance. And it can be different at different times. Obviously, it is different at different times, like we can be out of balance in different directions at different times. And so we just work to bring it into balance. And I think that is going to ultimately be the answer to many, many kinds of questions. Should I sit or should I walk? Should I lie down? Um, Definitely there are times where, either because of physical pain or just agitation, lying down is better. But if you're incredibly sleepy, it may not be the best choice in that particular moment. So it's a practice where we repeat certain phrases. You don't have to try to force an emotion or a feeling. You just gather all your attention behind one phrase at a time. The skill set's the same. Your mind will wander. See if you can let go and come back. And we make this offering to a variety of different beings, ourselves. And this is over time, not all in one session, because it would be too much. In one session, ourselves, someone we feel grateful to. That could be an adult, could be a child, could be a pet. Like who the texts say, this is the one who, when you think of them, you smile. Maybe you've never met them, but they've inspired you from afar. That being is known as a benefactor. To friends, we make that offering to the person I just described, the neutral person, and obviously that can change over time. Classically, we then make that offering at some point to those we find difficult. And again, you have to really understand what we're doing and what we're not doing. It's not saying, may you triumph in your terrible behavior or anything like that, but the phrases that are used in Tibetan Buddhism, I think, express that aspect of the practice where they say, may you have happiness in the causes of happiness, right? The causes of happiness would probably be something like connection, wisdom, clarity, living well, knowing we're going to die. May you be free of suffering and the causes of suffering, hostility, objectifying others, being removed, disconnected, the causes of suffering. May you have happiness and the causes of happiness. May you be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. And then all beings everywhere. All those we know, those we don't know, near and far. So, like I said, it's way too much to do all that in one session. So what I'd like to do is kind of guide you through a meditation and then maybe a short period of walking, because there's a way of doing it walking. Guide you through that and then come back and do a little bit of time and questions and maybe another sitting if we can get it in. Somebody put in the chat, I told the guy at the grocery store that he's my neutral person when I do this. He was clueless. Yeah. So usually the bookends for any session of doing loving kindness meditation is starting with yourself and ending with all beings everywhere. So you might just have time for one other being in the middle. You don't have to try to get through all of them. Or we probably do a couple of others in the middle. You also should note that the underlying principle of the practice is doing it in the easiest way possible. And so the irony is that apparently 2,600 years ago, in the time of the Buddha and the culture of the Buddha, we ourselves were the easiest person. That's why you start with yourself. And since this is so clearly not true for many, I just go back to the original principle. Maybe start with your puppy, start with the benefactor, someone with whom it's easy. Offer loving kindness to yourself later. It doesn't have to be in the sequence um, that's formally, classical. It should be the easiest way possible. Do include yourself somewhere along the line, but it doesn't have to be in the very beginning. But that's how I'll guide it, as though you're starting with yourself and ending with all beings. Okay, so you might want to stretch or wiggle, get comfortable, and then we'll do some sitting. And you can sit comfortably, close your eyes or not. If your eyes are open, they can also be like a little bit open. You could find a spot to rest your gaze, let it go. And it's fine to change midway as well. Let your energy kind of sink into your body. You can pay attention to a couple of breaths if you like. And then let go of the breath as an object of awareness. And begin repeating phrases for yourself. It's 3 or 4 phrases, and you want them to be big enough or general enough so that for the most part, you can use the same phrases with others. I mean, sometimes it needs to change, but you don't want to change it all the time because you'll lose concentration. That's why they tend to be phrases like, may I be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. Live with ease means in the things of day-to-day life, like livelihood and family, may not be such a struggle. May I live with ease. May I be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. You can use these phrases or other phrases, 3 or 4 phrases. Gather all your attention behind one phrase at a time. And then the next. You can repeat the phrases in a rhythm that's pleasing to you with enough space and enough silence. I had a friend who thought he'd get extra credit for saying more phrases, and you say them really fast, try to yell in. You don't need to do that. And the skill set is really the same. Your mind may wander for sure. It's okay. You realize you're gone, see if you can let go, return to the phrases. May I be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. Remember, it's natural for your mind to wander. It's okay. You can recognize you've been gone, and with some kindness toward yourself, see if you can let go and return to the phrases. And see if you can think of a benefactor, that being, when you call them to mind, you smile. It just sort of lifts your spirits. Maybe you've met them, maybe you haven't met them. Could be an adult, could be a child, could be a pet. It's like an embodiment of the force of love for you. So if you think of someone, you can bring them here, get an image of them, say their name to yourself, get a feeling for their presence, and offer the phrases of loving kindness to them. May you be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease, or whatever your phrases have been. Remember, you're not trying to force a certain feeling or emotion, but gather all your attention behind one phrase at a time. The power of the practice is in that full, wholehearted presence behind the phrase. May you be safe, be happy, Be healthy. Live with ease. And think of a friend. Let's start with a friend who's doing well right now. They may not be perfectly happy, but at least in some arena of life, they're enjoying success or good fortune. So if you think of someone like that, bring them here. You can get an image of them or say their name to yourself, get a feeling for their presence, and offer the phrases of loving kindness to them.
May you be well and at peace.
And then a friend who's having a difficult time right now, bring them here. See what happens as you offer the phrases of loving kindness to them. And then everybody here. May we be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. And then all beings everywhere, all people, all creatures, all those in existence, near and far, known and unknown. May all beings be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze and we'll end the meditation. So thank you, and all beings thank you. I usually say that many years ago I was teaching in Switzerland, and somebody said to me she'd had a really, really hard year. And the one thought that really kept her going was that somewhere in the world, someone was offering loving kindness to all beings everywhere, and she was a being. So, not because she'd done anything like to deserve it or earn it, but just because she existed, someone somewhere was wishing her well. So as soon as she said that, I thought, well, that's really true. And we could stop every now and then and realize that people of all kinds of different traditions and orientations, just through their own values, are offering well wishing to everyone that exists. And we could actually stop and receive it for a few moments, and it would be very powerful. And of course, we can generate it. So I want to briefly answer two of the questions that have come in, have us do a little bit of walking practice and then another sitting. So somebody asked, should you focus on one part or the whole body when trying to do tasks while being present? We focus on whatever's predominant. It's a little bit of the same principle. You want to do it in the easiest way possible. So if holding something in your hands means that sensation is predominant, that's what you want to focus on, rather than, trying to be with something more subtle or removed, right? So whatever's predominant is what we focus on, and that should make it easier. And then somebody says, I'm new to loving kindness practice and have found it much more difficult than Vipassana or mindfulness. Actively trying to radiate love and kindness to myself and others often becomes emotionally overwhelming and tinted by pain. So there are a couple of things I would say to that. One is you also don't have to do it, it's an experiment and it may be less meaningful to you right now than it might be later, or there are ways of just doing loving kindness in a lighter way, more casual way, like when you look at all the faces in Zoom, or you're in the grocery store, or I used to try to do loving kindness whenever I was waiting, and I counted every mode of transportation as waiting. Airplanes, those around me, those on the plane, uh, walking down the streets of New York. Um, and we'll go into some walking instruction in a minute. Um, those brief, it's what one of my students, to my eternal amusement, called microdosing loving kindness. Just little moments here and there, rather than making it a steady part of a formal practice. If you are going to make it part of a formal practice, I know there are a lot of people who teach it differently than I do, and they talk more about radiating love and kindness. And I'm more um, of the school that you don't have to worry about what you're feeling. That can be a bridge too far and a bit of a strain, especially if you have a narrow definition of what you're trying to feel. But more just using phrases, gathering your attention around the phrases and seeing what happens. Because I have done loving kindness practice a whole lot, and I've done it a whole lot feeling nothing and thinking nothing's happening, only in life, which is where it counts, to discover, oh, something was happening. Look at that. I couldn't have told you that at the time, but something was happening. And so uh, it's the way I teach it, and I know other people teach it differently. But if you find it a strain, that could also be some reason why. Is that, I've got to make something happen, or it's not cooking, or whatever it might be. And you could, if you want, try it another way, which is also lighter than that kind of strain. So it's really up to you. But keep experimenting. That's very important that you get exposure to different kinds of practice, because in the end, you will probably do different kinds of practice in some sequence or another, and um, with a lot more experience and confidence over time. Okay, so in doing loving kindness while walking, again, there are many ways of doing it. The way I like to do it is, of course, eyes open. You don't need to slow down at all. And the way I like to do it, you may not be in a situation right now where you're going to encounter, maybe you'll see a pet or something. I don't know if you'll encounter any other people, but I like to do it with the baseline of loving kindness from myself. And just usually it's one word to match the pace. So it's like happy, peaceful, silently, happy, peaceful, something like that, with the orientation of sending it to myself. And then when someone comes by or I hear a sound, maybe I hear a bird, hear a dog, or even somebody comes strongly into my consciousness, I just spend a few moments like, I'll be happy. It's really fun if you are walking down, say, a city street, and you will encounter other people. I find that uh, it's really fun because all of the same judgments may arise, but I cap it with a little loving kindness, like, you're wearing the wrong sweater for the season. I'll be happy. And just see what happens. You never know who's going to come by. Uh, and you just sprinkle, you just offer a little loving kindness into the world and do that. So why don't we take just like 10 minutes or so, and you get up, you stretch, do some walking, take some steps, silently doing loving kindness, see what it's like, and then we'll come back. Okay.